Carl Jung discovered something that would terrify every narcissist. A fed-up empath is more dangerous than they ever imagined. Not because they become cruel, because they become unbreakable. In his decades of clinical observation, Jung documented a psychological phenomenon so profound it challenged everything we thought we knew about power dynamics. He watched empaths, those gentle, giving souls who absorb everyone's pain, reach a breaking point that transforms them into something far more formidable than their abusers. Jung called this the alchemical moment, when years of absorbed poison suddenly transmutes into pure psychological gold. Empath stops being the passive vessel for others' darkness and becomes an active force of light that no manipulation can dim. The most shocking part, Jung realized that narcissists unconsciously fear this transformation more than anything else because a fed-up empath doesn't fight back with the same weapons. They transcend the entire battlefield. Join me as we descend into Jung's most profound insights about what happens when the gentlest souls finally say enough, and why that moment changes everything. Because here's what Jung discovered that modern psychology still refuses to acknowledge. The empath's gentleness was never weakness. It was strength in disguise, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. Jung wrote, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." But for empaths, this acceptance requires something even more terrifying. Accepting that they possess a power they've been taught to fear. What I call the shadow integration of the wounded healer. Think about this from Jung's perspective on archetypes. The empath embodies what he called the wounded healer, someone who gains wisdom through suffering. But Jung observed something remarkable. When this archetype reaches its breaking point, it doesn't break, transforms into what I call the sovereign healer. Someone who heals from a position of strength rather than sacrifice. This transformation isn't gentle. It's not a gradual awakening accompanied by soft music and meditation. It's what Jung called enanteroia, the principle that everything eventually turns into its opposite. The endless giver becomes the conscious chooser. The perpetual absorber becomes the strategic reflector. Modern neuroscience confirms what Jung intuited. Empaths' brains are wired differently. Dr. Judith Olaf's research shows that empathic individuals have hyperactive mirror neurons and heightened activity in areas associated with emotional processing. But what Jung realized, and what science is just catching up to, is that this same wiring that makes empaths vulnerable also makes them incredibly powerful when they learn to direct it consciously. But that's not the most dangerous part. The most dangerous part is what happens when an empath finally integrates what Jung called the shadow. All the repressed anger, boundaries, and self-protection they've been taught to deny. Jung observed that empaths don't just suppress their own negative emotions. They become unconscious containers for everyone else's shadow material. The rage their parents couldn't express, grief their friends couldn't process, the manipulation their partners couldn't acknowledge. The empath becomes what I call a walking trauma repository. But Jung discovered something extraordinary. When empaths finally reach their limit, they don't just release this accumulated shadow. They alchemize it. They transform years of absorbed poison into what he called psychological gold. This is the process Jung termed the transcendent function, the ability to transform opposite forces into something entirely new. Here's how this transformation actually unfolds, and this is where Jung's observations become terrifying for narcissists. Stage 1, the recognition. The empath suddenly sees the pattern. All those times they absorbed blame that wasn't theirs. All those moments they apologized for others' bad behavior. All those years they believed that love meant endless giving while receiving crumbs. Jung called this the lifting of the veil. When unconscious patterns become conscious. Stage 2, the integration. The empath doesn't reject their sensitivity. They weaponize it. They use their hyperpive abilities not to absorb and please, to see through manipulation before it begins. Jung observed that integrated empaths become psychological seers. They can read people's unconscious motivations with surgical precision. Stage 3, the sovereignty. The empath stops seeking external validation and becomes what Jung called individuated, psychologically whole, and self-directed. They no longer need others to complete them because they've completed themselves through conscious shadow work. This process creates what I call the empathic paradox. The more an empath integrates their shadow, the more compassionate they become. But their compassion is no longer naive. It's fierce, discerning, and absolutely terrifying to those who depend on empathic dysfunction to feel powerful. If you've ever been told you're too sensitive, felt there was hidden strength in that sensitivity, comment, "My sensitivity is my superpower." Now you're discovering what Jung called the dark side of empathy, not the absorption of others' pain, but the conscious use of empathic abilities for discernment and protection. When an empath awakens, their sensitivity doesn't diminish, It becomes surgical. They can feel the narcissist's emotional state beneath their performance. They sense manipulation before it's fully formed. They detect lies through micro-expressions and energy shifts that others miss completely. Jung understood that this level of perception is actually a form of what he called active imagination, the ability to perceive psychological realities that operate beneath surface appearances. The awakened empath becomes what I call a truth detector that no amount of charm or manipulation can fool. Let me show you this transformation through 3 real-world scenarios. The workplace predator. Sarah worked with a colleague who was masterful at taking credit while deflecting blame. For years, Sarah absorbed his projections, believing his gaslighting, questioning her own perceptions. But when she applied Jung's shadow work, she began to see the pattern. She stopped explaining herself, stopped defending her work, stopped trying to prove her competence to someone whose opinion was irrelevant. The shift was immediate. Without Sarah's emotional labor to feed on, her colleague's mask began slipping. Others started noticing his behavior because Sarah was no longer absorbing the tension he created. She had become what Jung called psychologically immune to his manipulations, the family manipulator. Michael's mother had controlled him for years through guilt, shame, and emotional blackmail. She would threaten suicide when he set boundaries, play victim when he succeeded, and make every conversation about her pain. Michael had spent decades being her emotional regulator. But when Michael integrated Jung's teachings about individuation, he stopped participating in the drama. He felt compassion for his mother's pain without taking responsibility for it. He set boundaries without explanation. He refused to be drawn into arguments about his worth or choices. His mother's manipulations became desperate, then eventually stopped. Without Michael's participation, she was forced to find healthier ways to meet her emotional needs or to find new victims. Michael had become what I call manipulation-proof. The romantic vampire. Lisa had been in a relationship where she constantly walked on eggshells, managing her partner's moods, accepting responsibility for their happiness. She believed that love meant endless sacrifice, and that her partner's criticism was helping her become a better person. When Lisa discovered Jung's work on psychological projection, she realized her partner was using her as a dumping ground for their own self-hatred. Every criticism they leveled at her was actually something they couldn't accept about themselves. Lisa stopped defending, stopped explaining, stopped trying to earn love from someone incapable of giving it. The relationship ended quickly. Without Lisa's unconscious participation in the dynamic, there was nothing left. Her partner couldn't maintain the illusion of superiority without someone to feel superior to. In each case, the empath didn't become cruel or vengeful. They simply became conscious. And consciousness, as Jung knew, is the greatest threat to unconscious manipulation. But here's where Jung's understanding becomes truly revolutionary. The fed-up empath doesn't just escape the narcissistic dynamic. They transform it into wisdom that makes them immune to future manipulation. Jung called this process the integration of opposites. The empath learns to hold both compassion and discernment, both openness and boundaries, both love and self-protection. They become what I call the integrated warrior healer. Someone who can love fiercely while protecting themselves completely. This integration creates what Jung termed the transcendent function, a psychological state where apparent opposites unite to create something greater than the sum of their parts. The empath's former weakness becomes their strength, but their former strength doesn't become weakness. Instead, both qualities mature into conscious wisdom. Jung observed this transformation in his clinical work repeatedly. He wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." For empaths, this means not just seeing their own shadow, but recognizing how they've been unconsciously complicit in their own victimization. The awakened empathizes they weren't targeted randomly. They were chosen because they possessed something the narcissist lacked, the capacity for genuine feeling, authentic connection, and real empathy. But instead of giving these gifts away unconsciously, they learned to share them consciously with those who can reciprocate. This creates what I call the empathic revolution. Instead of trying to heal the unhealable, empaths begin to seek out and nurture other conscious beings. They stop being drawn to broken people who need fixing and start being attracted to whole people who want to grow together. If you've realized that your empathy is not a weakness to be managed, but a strength to be directed, comment, "I choose who receives my energy." Here's Jung's framework for empath method based on his principles of individuation and shadow integration. Or recognize the pattern. Jung emphasized the importance of making unconscious patterns conscious. The empath must see how they've been participating in their own depletion. This isn't self-blame, it's empowerment. Jung wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." Start documenting your interactions. When do you feel drained? Who consistently takes more than they give? What stories do you tell yourself to justify staying in depleting relationships? Jung called this the examination of conscience, not from a moral standpoint, but from a psychological one. I integrate the shadow. Jung believed that shadow integration was essential for psychological wholeness. For empaths, this means reclaiming all the qualities they've been taught to suppress. Anger, selfishness, the capacity to say no without explanation. The shadow isn't evil, unlived life. Your anger might be righteous indignation that needed expression. Your selfishness might be healthy self-care that was overdue. Your capacity for boundaries might be wisdom disguised as coldness. Practice expressing these shadow qualities in small, safe ways. Say no to a request without elaborate justification. Feel angry without immediately trying to understand the other person's perspective. Choose yourself without feeling guilty about it. Stop the energy leak. Jung understood that psychological energy is finite and precious. Empaths must learn what he called psychological economy, the conscious management of their emotional and mental resources. This means identifying energy drains and plugging them systematically. Stop explaining yourself to people who don't want to understand. Stop trying to convince those who are committed to misunderstanding you. Stop giving your attention to people who use it as a weapon against you. Create what I call energy audits. Regularly assess who and what in your life adds to your vitality versus what depletes it. Jung believed that protecting your psychological energy is not selfish. It's necessary for psychological health. Embody authentic power. Jung's ultimate goal was individuation, becoming who you truly are rather than who others need you to be. For empaths, this means embodying their full spectrum of human experience, not just the parts that others find comfortable. Authentic power isn't dominance over others. It's sovereignty over yourself. It's the ability to choose your responses rather than react unconsciously. It's the strength to love without losing yourself, to give without depleting yourself, to care without sacrificing yourself. This embodiment terrifies those who have benefited from your unconsciousness because they can no longer predict or control your responses. You become what Jung called psychologically autonomous, self-directed rather than other-directed. When an empath awakens using Jung's principles, they don't just transform their own life, they contribute to what Jung called the collective consciousness evolution. Jung believed that individual psychological development impacts the entire human collective. When one person breaks free from unconscious patterns, they create what I call permission waves that help others do the same. The awakened empath becomes a living example that transformation is possible. But Jung also warned about what he called the inflation of the ego, the danger of becoming arrogant about one's psychological development. The awakened empath must guard against seeing themselves as superior to those still trapped in unconscious patterns. True empathic awakening includes humility. The empath remembers their own journey from unconsciousness to awareness and feels compassion for others still making that journey. They become what Jung called wounded healers who have been healed, capable of helping others without losing themselves in the process. This creates what I call conscious empathic communities. Groups of people who have done their own inner work and can love each other without drama, manipulation, or energy vampirism. These communities become models for healthy human relationship based on mutual respect rather than unconscious need. Jung envisioned a future where enough individuals achieved psychological wholeness to impact the collective human psyche. The awakened empath is part of this vision. They're not just healing themselves. They're contributing to the healing of human relationship patterns that have been dysfunctional for generations. But here's what Jung understood that makes fed-up empaths truly dangerous. They expose the entire system of unconscious manipulation that our society is built on. When empaths stop absorbing others' projections, stop managing others' emotions, stop sacrificing themselves for unworthy causes, they reveal how much of human interaction is based on unconscious psychological vampirism. They show that much of what we call normal relationships are actually dysfunctional patterns disguised as love, care, or responsibility. Jung wrote, "The world hangs on a thin thread, and that thread is the psyche of man." The awakened empath represents what happens when that psyche becomes conscious of its own power and refuses to participate in unconscious destruction. This is why awakened empaths often face resistance, not just from narcissists, but from entire family systems, workplace cultures, and social groups that depend on their unconscious participation. The empath's awakening threatens the status quo of unconscious relationship dynamics. Jung believed this resistance is necessary for collective growth. He called it the tension of opposites, the conflict between conscious and unconscious forces that ultimately leads to psychological evolution. The awakened empath represents the conscious force that challenges unconscious patterns. This makes them dangerous to anyone whose power depends on others remaining unconscious. They become what I call unconsciousness disruptors. People whose mere presence challenges others to examine their own psychological patterns. The narcissist fears the awakened empath because they can no longer use them. But the entire system of unconscious manipulation fears awakened empaths because they model a different way of being that makes unconscious patterns visible and unacceptable. If you've noticed that your growth has made some people uncomfortable, but you refuse to shrink back to make them comfortable, comment, "I will not dim my light for others' darkness." But here's Jung's most profound insight about fed-up empaths. Their ultimate danger lies not in what they do, in what they refuse to do anymore. They refuse to absorb what isn't theirs. They refuse to manage others' emotions. They refuse to sacrifice their well-being for others' comfort. They refuse to explain themselves to those who don't want to understand. They refuse to participate in drama that doesn't serve growth. This refusal is more powerful than any attack because it's based on Jung's principle of psychological non-violence. The awakened empath doesn't need to fight the narcissist. They simply withdraw their participation from the dynamic. Without the empath's unconscious cooperation, the entire manipulative system collapses. Jung observed that this withdrawal often triggers what he called the shadow projection crisis in the narcissist. Without the empath to carry their dissound feelings, the narcissist is forced to face their own emotional reality. This is unbearable for someone who has spent their life avoiding their inner world. The narcissist may escalate their manipulation attempts, become more aggressive, or frantically seek new sources of empathic supply. But the awakened empath remains unmoved. They've learned what Jung called psychological immunity, the ability to witness others' emotional storms without being pulled into them. This immunity isn't coldness, it's clarity. The empath can feel compassion for the narcissist's pain while refusing to enable their harmful behavior. They can love the person while rejecting the dysfunction. This nuanced response is something narcissists cannot understand or manipulate. Jung identified 3 levels of empathic development, and understanding where you are determines your vulnerability to manipulation. Level 1, the unconscious empath. You feel everything but understand nothing. You absorb others' emotions without realizing it. You believe that love means endless giving and that boundaries are selfish. You attract energy vampires because you haven't learned to protect your psychological space. At this level, your empathy controls you rather than you controlling it. You're like a sponge that soaks up whatever it encounters. The goal is developing what Jung called psychological boundaries, the ability to feel with others without losing yourself in them. Level 2, the awakening empath. You recognize your empathic abilities and begin to understand how they've been used against you. You start learning about Jung's concepts of projection, shadow work, and psychological boundaries. You begin to see patterns in your relationships and take responsibility for your part in them. At this level, you're beginning to develop what Jung called conscious empathy, the ability to choose when and how to engage your empathic abilities. You're learning to distinguish between your emotions and others' emotions. Level 3, the sovereign empath. You've integrated Jung's teachings about shadow work and individuation. You can feel deeply without being overwhelmed. You can love fully without losing yourself. You've developed what Jung called psychological sovereignty, the ability to remain centered in your own truth while remaining open to others. At this level, your empathy becomes a tool for wisdom rather than a weapon used against you. You can sense others' emotional states without taking responsibility for them. You can offer support without sacrificing yourself. The journey from level 1 to level 3 requires what Jung called the courage to become conscious. You must be willing to see how you've participated in your own victimization, not to blame yourself, but to reclaim your power to choose differently. Jung issued a warning about empathic awakening that every fed-up empath must understand. With great psychological power comes great responsibility. The awakened empath possesses abilities that can be used for healing or harm. Their ability to see through others' masks, to detect deception, to understand hidden motivations. These gifts must be used consciously and ethically. Jung emphasized that the goal of individuation isn't to become invulnerable, but to become authentic. The awakened empath must guard against becoming what they once suffered under, someone who uses psychological insight to manipulate rather than heal. The highest expression of empathic awakening is what Jung called conscious compassion, the ability to love without enabling, to help without rescuing, to see clearly without judging harshly. This is the difference between empathic wisdom and empathic revenge. Some empaths, when they first awaken to their power, want to use it to hurt those who hurt them. They want to expose narcissists, to shame manipulators, to make others feel the pain they felt. But Jung understood that this keeps you trapped in the very dynamic you're trying to escape. True empathic sovereignty means rising above the need for revenge. It means using your gifts to create healthy relationships rather than destroy unhealthy ones. It means being dangerous to manipulation while remaining safe for authentic connection. The fed-up empath's ultimate power is not in what they can do to others, in what they can create for themselves. A life of authentic relationships, conscious choices, and genuine peace. Remember Jung's discovery about fed-up empaths being more dangerous than narcissists ever imagined. The danger was never in becoming cruel or vengeful. The danger was in becoming conscious, sovereign, and immune to manipulation. Jung wrote in his final works, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." For empaths, this means embracing both their sensitivity and their strength, their compassion and their discernment, capacity to love, and their right to be loved authentically in return. The empath who finally says enough doesn't lose their ability to feel deeply. They gain the ability to feel wisely. They don't close their heart. They learn to open it selectively to those who have earned access through their own consciousness and authenticity. Jung observed that the greatest danger to unconscious systems is not conscious opposition, but conscious withdrawal. When empaths stop participating in dysfunctional dynamics, those dynamics can no longer sustain themselves. Your sensitivity was never your weakness. It was your early warning system, alerting you to toxic people and environments. Your deep feeling was never too much. It was the full spectrum of human experience that others had learned to numb. Your desire for authentic connection was never naive. It was your soul calling you toward relationships worthy of your depth. The narcissist feared your awakening because they knew that once you saw clearly, you could never be fooled again. Once you valued yourself properly, you could never be undervalued. Once you understood your worth, you could never be convinced to settle for less. Jung's vision was of humans who had integrated all aspects of themselves, light and shadow, strength and vulnerability, love and boundaries. The awakened empath embodies this integration. They become dangerous not through aggression but through absolute authenticity. This authenticity is revolutionary because it refuses to participate in the unconscious agreements that keep dysfunctional systems functioning. It says, "I will no longer absorb what isn't mine. I will no longer manage what I didn't create. I will no longer sacrifice my truth for others' comfort." If you're ready to stop being dangerous to yourself and start being dangerous to manipulation, comment, "I am sovereign in my empathy." Your journey from unconscious victim to conscious sovereign is not just personal transformation, it's contribution to collective healing. Every empath who awakens makes it easier for the next one to do the same. Share this with someone who needs to remember their empathic power. And if you want to understand more about Jung's insights into empathic protection, check out my video, Final Warning to Empaths, They're Feeding on Your Light, where I reveal Jung's most disturbing discovery about energy vampirism. Subscribe, because we're just beginning to explore the depths of empathic sovereignty. Remember, you're not too much, you're not too sensitive, you're not too deep. You're exactly what this unconscious world needs to wake up. Thank you for watching. See you in the next dimension.